Alexander Kane's last thought when his heart attack hit was about the unfinished deal at his company. The nurse he saw entering the operating room was Sarah Mitchell, the woman he had abandoned 12 years ago when she was pregnant, and now she was the one who had to save his life. Alexander Kane collapsed on the marble floor of his Manhattan office, crushing chest pain radiating through his body, his mind still focused on the Tokyo deal that remained incomplete. The 52-year-old millionaire businessman, CEO of Kane Industries, was accustomed to maintaining complete control over every aspect of his life. But now his body was refusing to obey him, and this loss of control terrified him more than the physical pain. As ambulance sirens wailed through Madison Avenue, Alexander lay semi-conscious on the stretcher, paramedics working efficiently around him. His assistant Margaret walked alongside, frantically calling Tokyo partners to inform them the critical merger meeting would have to be postponed. Even in this moment of medical crisis, Alexander's world continued to revolve around business obligations and financial commitments. Mount Sinai Hospital's emergency department received Alexander as a VIP patient, directing him immediately to the private wing that bore his name, thanks to substantial donations over the years. The Kane Cardiac Center had been established after his first mild heart attack 5 years earlier, and now it would ironically serve as the facility attempting to save his own life. Dr. Harrison, one of the hospital's leading heart surgeons, assessed Alexander's condition with grave concern while consulting with his surgical team. He had suffered a massive myocardial infarction requiring emergency bypass surgery. Alexander's age and history of stressful lifestyles significantly complicated the situation. They were racing against time to prevent permanent heart damage or death. The surgical preparation moved with practiced efficiency that Alexander, even in his compromised state, could appreciate from a business perspective. This was a well-oiled operation, every team member knowing their role and executing with precision. As they wheeled him toward the operating room, Alexander felt the unfamiliar sensation of complete powerlessness, his fate entirely in the hands of medical professionals he barely knew. The anesthesiologist began explaining the procedure, but Alexander's attention was caught by a familiar voice coordinating with the surgical team. Through his medication-induced haze, he heard someone discussing his medical history, allergies, and preoperative requirements with the kind of thorough professionalism that reminded him of his own approach to complex business negotiations. As they positioned him on the operating table, Alexander's vision began to clear momentarily, and he found himself looking up into the face of the lead surgical nurse preparing instruments nearby. The woman wore surgical scrubs and a cap that covered most of her hair, but her eyes were unmistakably familiar. Those same warm brown eyes that had once looked at him with love, then with desperate pleading, and finally with devastated disappointment 12 years ago. Sarah Mitchell stood 3 feet away from him, now wearing the authority of a senior surgical nurse, directing other team members with quiet confidence as they prepared for his life-saving operation. Alexander's heart monitor began beeping more rapidly as recognition flooded through him, though whether from medical distress or emotional shock was impossible to determine. The last time Alexander had seen Sarah, she had been standing in his penthouse apartment, tears streaming down her face as she told him about the pregnancy that would change both their lives forever. She had been 28 then, a graduate student working part-time as a research assistant while pursuing her nursing degree. Alexander had been 40, already successful but nowhere near the financial empire he would build over the following decade. Their relationship had been passionate but complicated, a collision between Sarah's idealistic view of love and family and Alexander's ruthless ambition to build generational wealth. For 18 months, they had navigated the challenges of different backgrounds and incompatible life goals, Sarah hoping that love would eventually triumph over Alexander's obsession with professional success. The pregnancy had forced a decision that Alexander approached like any other business problem, requiring cost-benefit analysis. A child would complicate his expansion plans, divide his attention during crucial negotiations, and tie him to responsibilities that conflicted with the 70-hour workweeks required to compete in his industry. Sarah represented everything he thought he wanted in his personal life, but the baby represented everything that threatened his professional ambitions. Alexander had presented his position with the same logical precision he brought to merger discussions, explaining to Sarah that neither of them was ready for parenthood, that bringing a child into their unstable situation would be irresponsible, that her education and his career required focus that a baby would make impossible. He had offered to pay for the procedure that would solve their problem and allow them both to pursue their individual goals without complications. Sarah's response had shattered something fundamental between them. She had stared at him with disbelief and growing horror as she realized that the man she loved viewed their unborn child as a problem, requiring elimination rather than a miracle worthy of celebration. Her refusal to consider his solution and her insistence that she would raise the baby with or without his support had forced Alexander to make a choice he convinced himself was practical and mature. The breakup had been brutal and final. Alexander had told Sarah that if she chose to continue the pregnancy, she would do so without his involvement or support. He had made it clear that he would not be part of a child's life, would not provide financial assistance, and would not allow fatherhood to interfere with the business empire he was building. Sarah had left his apartment that night and never returned, disappearing from his life as completely as if she had never existed. Now, 12 years later, Alexander found himself entirely dependent on the professional skills of the woman whose heart he had broken and whose child he had rejected before it was even born. Sarah moved around the operating table with practiced efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, and coordinating with the surgical team as if his presence meant nothing more than any other patient requiring her expertise. Dr. Harrison began the procedure, while Sarah assisted with the seamless coordination that made her invaluable in high-stakes surgical situations. Alexander drifted in and out of consciousness under anesthesia. But in his lucid moments, he found himself studying Sarah's face, looking for signs of recognition or emotion that might indicate she remembered their shared past. Sarah's professionalism was absolute, her focus entirely on the medical requirements of the surgery rather than any personal history she might share with the patient. She had clearly developed into exactly the kind of healthcare professional Alexander might have admired in any other context, someone who brought intelligence, dedication, and skilled expertise to life or death situations. The surgery lasted 4 hours, during which Alexander's life hung in the balance, while Sarah and the medical team worked to repair the damage caused by years of stress, poor diet, and the relentless pressure Alexander had placed on his cardiovascular system in pursuit of financial success. Multiple bypasses were required to restore proper blood flow to his heart, a complex procedure that demanded perfect coordination between all team members. During the operation, Sarah's hands were often the ones adjusting equipment, monitoring vital signs, and ensuring that every instrument Dr. Harrison needed was immediately available. Her competence was evident in the way other staff members deferred to her judgment and followed her quiet instructions. She had clearly earned her position through skill and dedication rather than favoritism or politics. As Alexander emerged from anesthesia and the cardiac intensive care unit, his first conscious sensation was of someone checking his pulse, adjusting his medication lines, and monitoring the equipment that was keeping him stable during the critical post-operative period. Through the haze of pain medication and medical equipment, he saw Sarah reviewing his chart, making notes about his recovery progress, and coordinating with other nurses about his care requirements. The ICU was quiet during night shifts, giving Alexander unwanted time to process the implications of seeing Sarah again under these circumstances. She was no longer the young graduate student he had known, but a confident healthcare professional who had clearly built a successful career while raising the child he had refused to acknowledge. The irony was not lost on him that his life now depended entirely on her professional dedication and medical expertise. Over the following days, as Alexander's condition stabilized and he moved from intensive care to a private recovery room, Sarah remained part of his care team. She performed her duties with impeccable professionalism, never indicating through word or gesture that she recognized him or remembered their shared history. Her interactions with him were courteous but distant, focused entirely on medical requirements rather than personal connection. Alexander found himself studying Sarah during her shifts, noticing changes that 12 years had brought to her appearance and demeanor. She was more confident now, moving through the hospital with authority that came from years of experience in life or death situations. Her face showed lines of maturity and responsibility that spoke of challenges overcome and wisdom earned through difficult experiences. The wedding ring on Sarah's finger caught Alexander's attention during one of her routine checks of his vital signs. She had clearly moved on from their relationship, built a family with someone else, and created the kind of stable home life that Alexander had convinced himself was incompatible with professional success. The ring represented everything he had sacrificed in pursuit of wealth and power, everything he had told himself he didn't need or want. Alexander's business associates visited regularly, updating him on deals that required his attention and decisions that couldn't wait for his full recovery. Margaret brought contracts to sign, attorneys consulted on legal matters that demanded his input, and partners called with questions about ongoing negotiations. Even from his hospital bed, Alexander's empire required constant management and oversight. But watching Sarah work with patients who couldn't afford private rooms, seeing her treat every person with the same care and attention she provided to wealthy donors, forced Alexander to confront aspects of his life philosophy that he had never questioned. Sarah's dedication to healing and helping others stood in stark contrast to his own focus on accumulating wealth and defeating business competitors. During one late evening shift, when the hospital was quiet and most patients were sleeping, Sarah finally acknowledged their shared past. She approached Alexander's bed with his medication, her professional demeanor intact, but with something softer in her eyes that suggested the recognition he had been waiting for. Sarah's voice was steady, but contained layers of emotion, as she confirmed that she remembered everything about their relationship and its painful ending. She had known he was the patient from the moment she saw his name on the surgical schedule, had requested to be part of his care team specifically because she was one of the few nurses with experience in complex cardiac procedures who could handle the potential emotional complications of treating him. Alexander listened as Sarah explained the years following their breakup, how she had completed her nursing degree while pregnant, working multiple jobs to support herself and preparing for single motherhood with determination that surprised everyone who knew her situation. She had given birth to a daughter she named Emma, raised her alone while building a career in cardiac nursing, and eventually married a pediatric surgeon who had adopted Emma and loved her as his own child. The daughter Alexander had refused to acknowledge was now 11 years old, an honor student with interests in science and medicine, who knew nothing about her biological father's identity. Sarah had never sought child support or contacted Alexander about Emma's existence, choosing instead to build a stable family environment that didn't depend on his involvement or recognition. Sarah's husband knew about Alexander's existence and their daughter's biological parentage, she explained, but had never felt threatened by the knowledge because Alexander had made his position clear 12 years earlier. Emma had a father who attended her school events, helped with homework, and provided the emotional support that Alexander had rejected before she was even born. Alexander found himself confronting the full cost of the choice he had made during that crucial conversation 12 years earlier. He had gained the freedom to build his business empire without distractions, achieving financial success beyond his wildest early projections. Kane Industries was now worth hundreds of millions, his personal wealth ensuring luxury and comfort for the rest of his life. But the price of that success was lying before him in the form of a daughter he had never met, a child who shared his DNA but knew another man as her father. Emma had grown up without any knowledge of Alexander's existence, building her identity and relationships within a family structure that had no room for his wealth or influence. Sarah had clearly thrived despite the challenges Alexander's abandonment had created. Her career was flourishing, her marriage was stable, and her daughter was growing up in an environment of love and support that had nothing to do with financial resources or material advantages. She had built exactly the kind of meaningful life that Alexander had convinced himself required sacrificing professional ambitions. The conversation that followed over several nights was careful and limited, constrained by Sarah's professional obligations and her need to protect the family she had built from unnecessary complications. Alexander learned basic facts about Emma's life, her academic achievements, her interests in volleyball and piano, her close relationship with the stepfather who had earned his place through consistent presence and love. Alexander realized that any desire to establish a relationship with Emma would require navigating complex family dynamics and emotional territories where his usual tools of wealth and influence were not only useless but potentially harmful. Sarah's husband had legal parental rights. Emma had no emotional connection to Alexander, and forcing his presence into their lives would benefit no one except possibly his own conscience. The deeper revelation came as Alexander processed the implications of Sarah's success and happiness without him. She had not only survived his rejection but had flourished, building a career that brought meaning and purpose to her daily life, while raising a daughter who was thriving academically and socially. Sarah's life proved that the choice between family and professional success had been a false dilemma, created by Alexander's own limitations rather than practical reality. Other patients on Sarah's rounds included people from all economic backgrounds, individuals whose medical crises had nothing to do with their financial status and everything to do with the random challenges that affected human beings regardless of wealth or power. Sarah treated each person with the same level of care and attention, finding satisfaction in healing that transcended material considerations. Alexander's recovery progressed under Sarah's professional supervision, his heart healing from the surgical repairs, while his understanding of his own life choices underwent more fundamental reconstruction. The medications that regulated his cardiac function were less powerful than the daily exposure to Sarah's example of finding meaning through service rather than accumulation. Business matters continued to demand Alexander's attention even during recovery, but he found himself delegating more decisions to trusted associates rather than insisting on controlling every detail personally. The near-death experience had forced him to confront his own mortality and question whether the empire he had built would provide any comfort or meaning if he faced his final moments alone. Margaret brought news that the Tokyo deal had been successfully completed by Alexander's international team, proving that his company could function effectively without his constant oversight. Other negotiations proceeded smoothly under the management of executives Alexander had trained but never fully trusted with independent authority. His absence, rather than creating the chaos he had expected, revealed the strength of the systems and people he had developed over the years. Sarah's shifts provided structure to Alexander's days, her professional check-ins becoming moments he anticipated and valued more than the business updates that had once seemed crucial to his survival. Watching her work with other patients showed him aspects of character and competence that their earlier relationship had never revealed, qualities that might have flourished differently if he had been capable of supporting her goals rather than viewing them as threats to his own ambitions. The day before Alexander's discharge, Sarah approached him with a photograph she had carried in her wallet for 11 years. Emma's school picture showed a bright, confident girl with Sarah's warm eyes and Alexander's stubborn chin, a child who had clearly inherited intelligence and determination from both biological parents while developing within the loving environment Sarah and her husband had created. Alexander studied the photograph with intensity that surprised him, seeing features that were unmistakably his own combined with Sarah's gentleness and warmth. Emma looked happy and secure, surrounded by friends in the school portrait, and wearing a smile that suggested confidence in her place in the world. She was everything Alexander had refused to risk his career to help create, but she had become that person anyway through Sarah's dedication and her stepfather's love. Sarah explained that she was sharing the photograph not to create guilt or obligation, but to show Alexander that his decision 12 years earlier had ultimately led to outcomes that served everyone's best interests. Emma had grown up with a father who chose to be present for her life. Sarah had built a career that brought her satisfaction while maintaining the family relationships she valued, and Alexander had achieved the financial success that had seemed so crucial during their original conflict. The conversation was both closure and beginning, an acknowledgement of the past that allowed both of them to move forward without resentment or regret. Sarah had long ago forgiven Alexander for his choice, understanding that his limitations at that time made him incapable of being the partner or father that she and Emma needed. Alexander began to understand that forgiveness was not about excusing his behavior, but about releasing its power to define future possibilities. Alexander's discharge from the hospital marked the end of his direct interaction with Sarah, but the beginning of a fundamental reassessment of his life priorities and definition of success. The cardiac surgery had repaired the physical damage to his heart, but seeing Sarah again had revealed emotional and philosophical damage that required different kinds of healing. The weeks following Alexander's return home were filled with cardiac rehabilitation exercises, dietary changes, and stress management strategies designed to prevent future heart problems. But the more significant changes were psychological and spiritual, as Alexander began questioning assumptions about happiness, success, and the meaning of a well-lived life that had guided his behavior for decades. Business continued to provide intellectual challenges and financial rewards, but Alexander found himself more interested in projects that created value for others rather than simply maximizing profits for shareholders. The philanthropic activities he had previously treated as tax advantages began receiving more personal attention and emotional investment. Alexander established a scholarship program for single mothers pursuing healthcare degrees, funding that would help women in situations similar to Sarah's 12 years earlier complete their education while supporting their children. The program was administered quietly through a foundation that didn't bear his name, providing assistance without seeking recognition or gratitude from recipients. The broader implications of his encounter with Sarah extended beyond personal regret to encompass questions about the kind of legacy Alexander wanted to leave and the definition of success that would bring him satisfaction during his remaining years. The business empire he had built could continue generating wealth long after his death, but it would provide no comfort during moments of personal crisis or meaning during periods of reflection about life's purpose. Alexander began reaching out to other people from his past, not to repair relationships that were beyond fixing, but to understand how his choices had affected others and whether there were patterns of behavior that needed changing. The picture that emerged was of someone who had achieved remarkable financial success while leaving a trail of damaged relationships and missed opportunities for deeper connection. 6 months after his heart attack, Alexander received a graduation announcement that Sarah had sent through her attorney. Emma was graduating from middle school with highest honors and planned to attend a prestigious high school with strong science programs, possibly leading to pre-med studies in college. The announcement included no request for contact or financial support, simply information that Alexander's biological daughter was thriving and moving toward her own successful future. Alexander framed the graduation announcement and placed it on his desk where he would see it daily, a reminder that the most important success story in his life was one he had played no role in creating but had indirectly made possible through his absence. Sarah and Emma had built something beautiful and meaningful without his wealth, influence, or involvement, proving that the fear-based decisions that had shaped his life had been based on false assumptions about what people needed to flourish. The heart attack that had nearly killed Alexander ultimately became the catalyst for the most significant growth of his life, forcing him to confront the difference between success and fulfillment, between achievement and meaning, between accumulation and contribution. Sarah Mitchell had saved his life in the operating room and then, through her example of grace and strength, had shown him possibilities for redemption he had never imagined existed.